Many chapters of Space Marines have worlds that they call home. From these worlds, bastions are raised and recruits are drawn, but the chapter that resides there aren't the only protectors of the planet's inhabitants. That duty falls to the Planetary Defense Forces, and it's one of these groups of human defenders that I intend to build in this video, particularly those from the Ultramar system, the home of the Ultramarines. I would focus this conversion on a leader of the Ultramar Auxillia, a Legatus, and would use the new Cadian Castellan as the basis. From this kit, I removed the parts required to build the legs and torso before trimming and cleaning away any mold lines. Now you may recognize where this build is going, especially if you follow a very talented digibasher known as Kabuski, who put together this digital mock-up that I'll be aiming to create in physical form. The Ultramarine markings and Roman-inspired details would be sourced from this Ultramarine upgrade sprue. This is of course the older Firstborn upgrade kit, rather than the newer Primaris one. After opening up the clan pack, the torso was removed from the sprue. This particular torso was selected due to the Sanguine Militarum, or strips of leather that hang from the belt. These will give the Castellan that desired Roman-like appearance, whilst also benefiting from the Ultra symbols. To separate the strips from the torso, clippers were carefully used to remove the belt, whilst retaining as much of the original torso as possible. Now this isn't entirely necessary, but it gives you another component to use in your other builds. Once removed, the cut was cleaned up and compared against the Castellan's torso. A few more clips were made, and the inside was trimmed down with my knife just to help things fit a little more snugly. Now that I was happy that the base Castellan wouldn't need to be trimmed down, I assembled the torso and legs before making yet another comparison. The fit still wasn't quite there though, so a few more final trims were made before the cingulum was glued into place. The next modification to make was to the weapon carried by the Legatus. The Ultramarines upgrade kit comes with an excellent Ultramarine styled short sword or gladius. This blade could be used to replace either the Castellan's chainsword or power sword. I opted for the former of these. To bond the two, the chainsword was first clipped away, leaving the handguard behind, which was also cleaned up a little. In a similar fashion, I then clipped away the gladius's blade. I did need to be careful here though, so as not to remove too much of the Ultramarine symbol. Again, this cut was then cleaned up. With both parts prepped, the sword was glued to the hand. This was followed up by attaching the hand and shoulder pad to the arm before gluing everything to the torso. For the right arm, I selected one with a pointing hand and attached it to the torso, leaving it unmodified. Now that the arms were in place, I could turn my attention to the head. My goal here was to combine the plume of the Ultramarine head with the helmeted Castellan head. To do this, the plume was first clipped away. As I did this, I made sure to retain as much of the supporting strut as possible. After a few tries to clean up the cut, the plume was compared against the Castellan's helmet. The central ridge would make attaching the plume much harder, so a small amount, the same diameter as the strut, was cut and shaved away until the two parts could fit together. I could have just glued the decoration straight to the helmet, but the large prominent plume was likely to get knocked off. To resolve this, I decided to bring in a favourite technique of mine, pinning. Two 1mm holes were carefully drilled into each of the contact surfaces. From here, a length of 1mm thick steel wire was superglued into the hole in the plume before being clipped down so just a few millimeters were left protruding. This exposed wire was then inserted into the hole in the helmet, completing the bond. But I didn't attach the head to the torso just yet. This would be kept separate to make it easier to paint later on. All that was left to do now was to add a few extra details taken from the Castellan kit and glue them around the waist. With the model complete, work could begin on the base. Rather than opting for the original Castellan base, I instead wanted to create the appearance of a marble floor. This was done by first filing down the surface of a regular base in order to create a smoother texture. With this done, a steel rule was used as a guide to scour in a line across 1/3 of the base, followed by a second running perpendicular from this. With some guidelines in place, the lines were expanded out with a combination of my knife and file. I couldn't completely remove the tactical rock from the model though, due to the angle of the legs. but I could give it a more of a marble chunk look by simply clipping away and shaving back the protruding rebar. But in order to attach the chunk to the base, the edge needed to be angled. I used clippers to first cut off a corner before it was smoothed out. As is always the case with these sort of things, a few comparisons and trims were made to make sure everything was lining up. Once I was happy with the fit, I glued the rock into place. And, in order to shoehorn a dead animal bit into this video, a skull from the Citadel skull set was added to the base to give it a little more detail. Like I mentioned earlier, the head was kept separated in order to make it easy to paint, but it needed a holder. So, like with the pinning earlier, a hole was drilled and some wire was glued into the head. Similarly, the castellan was superglued to a spare base. The superglue would make it easy to remove later on. And with that, I was finally ready to start painting. But before we paint, let's first hear a little bit about the sponsors of this video, VoxLink. VoxLink is an innovative app that makes it easy to find local tabletop gaming groups and events. And today I'm excited to tell you about their Kickstarter campaign and how you can support it. If you're watching this video, you're likely a fan of tabletop gaming, and you probably know how hard it can be sometimes to find a group to play with, or even arrange games with people outside of your usual opponents. But with this app, you can not only easily connect with other gamers in your area, but also find events to attend, all in one convenient place. VoxLink lets you search for opponents based on your interests and location. Whether you're looking for a small casual game or a large-scale competitive engagement, VoxLink has you covered. You can also create your own profile and share the cool things you're working on with others. Content is curated for you based on your preferences, so you don't need to trawl through numerous social media sites and groups to find what you want. But VoxLink needs your help, and with the support of backers like you, VoxLink will be able to connect gamers with local groups and events. The app will be free to use, but premium access will grant you discounts on events and select retailers, as well as giving you the option to create your own leagues and events. And by backing this project, you can grab yourself access to this premium membership at a discounted rate. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to the VoxLink Kickstarter to find out more about the project and pledge your support. You can find a link to the project in the comments below. Now, let's get back to painting. I began the painting of the model by priming everything black. While I used an airbrush for this, a regular Replicam black primer would work just as well. The real aim was to give the model a good surface to apply the paint to, and a dark starting point to form the shadows. For this tutorial, nearly all the paints that I'll be using were taken from the Too Thin Coats range, and for the first of these was Surcoat Silver. This paint would be used to tackle the steel areas of the model, which included the blade of the sword and the details attached to the wrist. Continuing with the metallics, some Spartan Bronze was then used to paint all of the gold details on the model, of which there are quite a few. The reason that I tackle the metallics first is because they can be quite difficult to cover up with other paints if you do make a mistake. So if you do the metallics first and spill over onto other areas, they can be cleaned up by applying a little more primer or black paint with a brush, and won't ruin your other paints. After this step, I also refresh my paint water to prevent cross-contamination of the metallic flakes into my other paints. I then continued the base coat by first painting the cloth of the model. For this, I chose to use some Dragon Fang, but first it was thinned out with a little water in a roughly 50-50 mix. Thinning out the paint allows it to flow more easily across the model, but the paint will still be a little patchy. So, after allowing the first layer to dry, a second thin layer was applied over the top. This created a more even coverage and solid colour. It is a much better approach than applying your paint in one thick coat, as it prevents a lumpy texture and details being obscured. This method of base coating was then repeated across all of the other base colours that I applied to the model. For the Legatus' armour, I applied a base coat of marine blue, making sure not to spill over onto the golden trim as I did so. For the red details, such as the sash, the cuffs and the segments of the plume, I started them off with a base coat of Berserker Red. The leather details, like the boots, belt and Cingulum Militare, were all given a coat of the dark brown of Scorched Earth. The remaining sections of the plume would ultimately be painted white, but I needed to start off with a base coat of Wizard Grey. which brought me to the final base coat of Barbarian Brawn, which was painted over the small amount of skin showing on the face. With all the base coats in place, work could begin on bringing out the details. One method for achieving this was to apply highlights to the raised details. These are usually paints that are a similar colour to the base coat, but are a little lighter. When applied across the details in a thin line, the lighter paint helps to lift it away from the darker surfaces that it sits adjacent to. This, in turn, helps these details to stand out a little more and prevents the model surfaces from looking flat and shallow. The first highlight to be applied was Skeleton Legion, and this was applied across the raised edges of any areas that I base coated with Dragon Fang. The highlights could be further enhanced and the details further lifted by applying a little shading in the recesses. To create this shadow, I created a mix of Dragon Fang and a little Scorched Earth. This darker version of Dragon Fang was then thinned out with a little water before being painted into the creases of the fabric. The darker paint created the appearance of shadows, giving the surface a more realistic appearance, as well as stronger points to contrast against the highlights. Speaking of highlights, the very light tan of Vampire Fang would be applied as an extreme highlight. Rather than painting these onto all the edges, I instead focused this light paint onto just the sharper points where two edges met. This simply enhanced the highlights already in place and allowed me to focus on a few of the more important details. This process of highlighting and extreme highlighting was then repeated across the rest of the model. For the blue armour, I first began with a highlight of Elysium Blue, followed up by an extreme highlight of Celestial Blue. The red areas were first highlighted with Sanguine Scarlet, where I paid close attention to the strands in the plume, and then followed these up with a few spots of the brighter Demon Red. I then tackled the leather details, first with some Ancient Forest, before picking out the corners with Wasteland Brown. The effort to lighten up the white parts of the plume was continued, first by using Carcharodon Grey to pick out the strands, before giving the top halves of the plumes a layer of white star to complete the look. For the small amount of face on display, some dwarven skin was carefully used to pick out a few facial details such as the chin, lips and nose. And these were then further accentuated with a small amount of elven skin. There were a few areas of the model that I had left as the original black primer, such as the gloves and the cable on the sword. These details only needed a subtle dark grey highlight, so I began with Death Reaper, before adding just a few spots of Dungeon Stone Grey. At this stage in the painting process, I had finished highlighting all of my non-metallic areas, but I had specifically chosen not to highlight the metal details just yet. I first decided to give the model a coat of matte varnish. This would help to protect the paintwork and also remove any potential glossiness. But by doing this before any metal highlights were applied, I wouldn't unintentionally dull down the reflective qualities of the metal highlights. I applied this matte varnish through my airbrush, but again, spray can varnish will work just as well. With the matte varnish complete, I could continue with those last few highlights. The first of these was plate armor, which was applied across the silver areas, before finally picking out the sharpest details with Mythril Blade. The highlights were then finished off by giving all of those details a very careful highlight of Dragon's Gold, and an extreme highlight of Glistening Gold, completing the model itself. But there was still the base. To create that marble effect that I'd already made a start on earlier, I first used my airbrush to add a few stripes of Dragon's Gold, which would create the appearance of golden veins within the marble. But to create that marble effect, I used the wet wipe technique. Basically, you take a wet wipe, let it dry out, and then stretch it until you have this fine, uneven mesh. This was then wrapped around the base before some white paint was sprayed over the top. After giving it a chance to dry, the wipe was removed, revealing a marbling effect. Basically, the fabric allowed some paint to get through, whilst also masking off other parts, resulting in that marble-like result. The small skull that I'd added to the base was then painted up using the same colours that I'd painted onto the tan fabric of the Castellan. To help create some effects of small pieces of rubble, I added some of the Lunar Desert texture paste from AK Interactive. This was layered up around the larger rock, as well as a few smaller piles. This just helped to add a little extra detail. In order to lighten up and bring out the texture of the rubble piles, they were given a light dry brush of White Star. The next few steps saw me applying a gloss varnish to the base for a number of reasons. First of all, it protects the paintwork. Second, it gives the marble that appearance of a smooth, shiny surface. And finally, it will help with the wash I intended to apply in the next step. The wash I'd chosen for this was Oblivion Black Wash, and this was painted directly into the seam between the tiles and around the rubble piles. Like earlier, this helped to darken down the recesses, helping to increase the level of depth in the detail. While the glossiness of the tiles was ideal, the glossiness on the skull wasn't, so some matte varnish was painted directly onto it in order to remove its shiny surface. All that was left to do now was to clean up the rim of the base with a layer of Doom Death Black, before removing the parts from their holders, scraping clean their contact points, and gluing everything together, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Legatus of the Ultramar Auxillia. To sum up, I'm really happy with this build. The result is quite clearly based in that ultramarine style, while still being recognisable as a regular human soldier of the Imperium. This theme would be fairly straightforward to apply across a larger force too. Your HQ units and squad leaders could be embellished with plumes and vexillium taken from Space Marine kits, while your regular rank and file could just be painted in this blue, tan and red scheme. Once again, I just want to give Kabuski and his excellent digibashes a shout out. I'll link to his socials below. Having a rough starting point to build upon made this kit bash that much easier, and if you enjoyed this guide and would like to see me tackle other Space Marine chapter serfs or planetary defense forces, then leave me your suggestions below. For those of you looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. Now before I go, let me say a big thank you to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters who are Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Johans, Jonathan Stanseed, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Sweatsman, and the Googles. And my Sergeant level channel members who are First Statement, Mr. Jared Hess 95, Nerdington Paints, Mark Taylor, Whale Tussler, and Philip Poya. If you're interested in supporting me, you can hit the join button below or find a link to my Patreon in the description. Supporters get a whole host of benefits, including ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, I also have a few t-shirts and mugs up for sale featuring designs drawn by me. You can check those out by following the links below or by going over to petethewargamer.com. So, until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.